women, doing all that stuff that we associate with Tom Mix and all of those guys.
Yeah.
So to your point about just what we've met, it's sort of like this lost world that had it continued, our entire notions of iconography and classical, what movies are supposed to look like would have been, just fundamentally changed.
Yeah, and what film directors look like.
Exactly. It reminded me, when you mentioned about when it all changed, the money obviously had a great deal to do with it, but the technology, and it reminded me of something Lena Dunham said, which was that the technology of filmmaking, the cameras and the sound, all that, it's been very masculinized. It's almost like a phallic symbol. It's sort of like you shoot a movie, and film crews are like, military. The directors like, it's all been very couched in these kind of militaristic, masculinized terms. And she said she was intimidated by that. She didn't feel that she could be a director because she was intimidated by the mechanics. And so it was the onset of digital equipment that was lighter, more accessible. She shot Tiny Furniture with a consumer-grade camera that she didn't feel. But I wanted to ask you also about, in listening to you, I wonder, this is very true, I think, with African American social history and politics, that when progress is made, the backlash is real, and the backlash can be legal and it can be political, but it can be cultural in terms of images and what kinds of images are, this is black, that's why we saw blackface come up when it did. And do you think that some of that disappearance of women from filmmaking, powerful positions, had anything to do with the real political progress that we were making then with getting the vote and things like that?
Yeah, it's interesting timing in terms of that. The little clip that I showed from Consequences of Feminism, that was happening right at the conversation of feminism, and I like to think that Alice Guy Blaché was making a comment or making a joke about the kinds of things that people were worried about with women gaining more power, that they would suddenly be like men and be these powerful beings that couldn't be controlled. And I think it has a lot to do with that. And of course, it's about money, it's about sexism, it's about, not seeing women as being business-minded and able to handle the money. And it was kind of like when it became a business, this is what we see often happen, when it becomes financially viable, men come in and say, we got this, it's all good, we'll take it from here.
Right. And I was also fascinated about, in the Alice Guy Blaché film, we see that she was literally written out of the history. That when people, and they were usually men, would write the histories of those early days of filmmaking, and part of that process of writing the history is creating the canon. It's referring to films that would then become elevated to canon. So two things are happening at once. She gets written out, she gets just forgotten, and then her films are not considered canon. They're not up there with the Chaplins and the Griffiths and the Edisons.
Yeah, they should be. And when Leon Gaumont, who was her boss, published the history of the company, he completely left out her story.
So do you have any, I know this is probably can only be speculation, but really, do you have any theories on why that is?
So it's really infuriating, and I think, we see this a lot, the fact that not only who we think about as making the films is very masculine, like I said, very masculine terms, but also who gets to talk about these films. And you've experienced this, I'm sure, being a female film critic. Even just yesterday I was flying over to Washington, and I always bring a film to watch on my tablet, and every single time I'm watching a classic film, the guy sitting next to me will stop to explain to me what it is I'm watching. So, because I was just accidentally watching Metropolis by Fritz Lang, as you do. So he stopped me and said, do you know what this is you're watching? And then went on to launch about this. Or once I was watching Feud, that TV show, and the guy was like, I bet you don't know who those people are. And I was like, actually, yeah, I do know Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. And often seems like it comes from a good place, maybe I'm naive, but it seems like they want to have a conversation about film, but I just think the very idea of who gets to talk about film and create film. I know being the sole female host on TCM, I get different kind of questions than my male counterparts do, and a lot of it is like, what do you know? Do you know anything? Like, prove it to me. And we've had that a lot, particularly with the creation of the film canon. You know, you see the AFI Top 100 list, and I know they're going to work on a new one because there's not a single female director on that list. And when you think about Alice Guy Blaché or Lois Weber, they deserve to be there. And that's what I was the most surprised about when I started to delve into this. I thought, why haven't they been talked about? And I know some film classes did mention them, but I think the majority do not.
Right. And I was also struck when you mentioned the Thelma and Louise. You know, we were talking earlier about Thelma and Louise. One of the supporters here, Lisa, was saying, "Do you think Thelma and Louise is a perfect movie?" And I said, "Yeah, it is. It's really, it's a perfect example of classical Hollywood entertainment." And I do remember that moment of seeing it and feeling so exhilarated and seen. I guess that's the term now, the term of art. And then, like you said, you think things are going to change, and then no, and then and Silence of the Lambs. That was another big turning point. And when I think of Silence of the Lambs, I remember there was a movie with Jodie Foster called The Brave One, where she's sort of an urban vigilante, like a Charles Bronson type of a heroine. And it didn't perform very well, I guess, during the first weekend. And the legend and lore has it that Monday, I think it was Warner Brothers, the head of Warner Brothers said, "That's it, no more women." Like there's no margin to fail or even falter, And whereas, can you speak to that a little bit?
I mean, I was so nervous about Wonder Woman because I felt like that had so much riding on it that it didn't just need to be a good movie, it needed to stand for how you could have a female solo superhero movie, because for so many years they would point to Catwoman, Elektra, and those failures that it couldn't work. But no, they were just bad movies. And so it is very true that the margin of error is so small, and the female directors and especially women of color directors, they have to speak for a whole gender, a whole race, and they have so much pressure on them, and it's not the same. It's not the same for male directors, and you do see that with that pipeline problem that you see a lot of great independent films made by women at Sundance, and you'll see a lot of great independent films made by men at Sundance, and suddenly the men are directing these Marvel films, or they're directing these big studio films, and women do not get the same kind of opportunity. And it really goes back to that idea of what we think about when we think of a director, and it's still seen as a risk to give money to women, where it's not the same for men.
You called your book The Female Gaze. Do you think there is a female gaze?
No, I don't. See, I thought that was just like a cool title to kind of talk about, but there can't be any equivalent, because the male gaze is very much tied to our very society, the patriarchal society, and the way that we view women. So there isn't an equivalent, and it's not an easy box to use, but I thought it was just a fun title for it, and a way to kind of catch people's eyes. But in the book, I explore how there is no one thing, and it's very varied.
Right. I mean, it was interesting watching Helen Holmes. I immediately flashed on Catherine Bigelow.
Yeah.
Or an Ida Lupino with The Hitchhiker. Using these all-male, with the all-male cast. I mean, Catherine, her whole métier is tribal behavior of men. In a way.
So I included Point Break as my Catherine Bigelow example in Female Gaze, because I think that's a really interesting look at bromance in movies.
Right.
It's quite romantic, this male friendship that happens.
Absolutely, and I think you may not want to, it might not be a female gaze, but I think your point and my point also would be that, and it's true of filmmakers of color, we can't reduce people to their gender or their ethnic identity. What we want is more, we want the perspectives and the voices and the visions.
Exactly.
And obviously you're bringing your gender and your ethnic identity and your sexual orientation with you, among many other things, all the things that make you you.
Exactly, you just want a variety of people to tell a variety of stories, and not have only women telling stories about women, and only, black filmmakers telling stories about black people. I mean, if they want to, great, but you should be able to talk about any kind of story.
Exactly. So tell me, are you optimistic? I mean, you say you're
I
optimistic,
say I am.
but it does feel like, yes, so now you're on the record, but it really does, it does feel different, and tell me why.
Well, the level of conversation is so different. I mean, even to have an event like tonight, I mean, this would be unheard of a couple of years ago, and have all you wonderful people, listening to someone like me talk about this. I mean, it's really exciting in terms of the things that are actually happening in Hollywood as well, because the conversation has grown, the statistics haven't changed just yet, nothing has changed, but there's so much happening. I love the idea of the inclusion rider, which is a clause that big stars can have put into their contracts to say that the cast and crew needs to be inclusive and diverse. And I think actionable changes like that will really start to move the needle. It's going to be a long road, but I just think it's so exciting now that people are aware of the problem and they're saying, what can we do now? And the level of media attention, they just can't go back to the way it was before.
Right, and it feels like social media, that is, even though it can be a toxic swamp, it can also hold people accountable in a way that they don't want to be shamed, that there might be an extra layer of pressure being brought to bear. I mean, do you get a sense that the male executives are getting it at all? I mean, it was interesting. I did a panel a couple of years ago at the Middleburg Festival with Greta Gerwig, and at one point she said, don't do this because it's the right thing to do, do it because it makes you money. I mean, it's like there's this, and that's also what I'm so curious about over these decades.
Yeah.
Women have always had a huge influence on the market as audience members and as influencers of their households. Yes. About what to see. So you would even think that just on a purely mercenary level, they would have wanted to cater to us more.
Exactly. Women have always been the majority of ticket buyers in this country. Right now it's 52% of women, plus you said they're usually the decision makers in a family and on a date as well.
Absolutely.
They're the ones that have the power when it comes to choosing the film, and it's also proven time and time again that female-led films and movies made by women do make money.
That's right, because generally, and certainly back to your point about trusting us with budgets, because of that lack of trust with big budgets, traditionally, historically, female-centric, female-led and made movies don't have huge budgets, and so ergo, and then when they overperform, i.e. they underestimated us again, they make money, they're profitable.
Yeah, and there's always a surprise, right?
Oh, exactly.
So it's like, what?
Shocking.
This movie made money?
Yeah, that word overperform. When you see the word overperform from Hollywood, just know that they screwed up again, and they didn't do their due diligence. They're making decisions not based on
exactly. A lot of the outdated data that they use are outdated myths that men won't go and see movies about women in the same way that women will go to see movies about men. That has been proven to be wrong time and time again.
Correct.
But a lot of these executives, they're very risk adverse, so they don't want to try anything, and women are still seen as a risk. I think now there are as much more opportunities for women to get in the door with the things that they have to do. But I've spoken to some female directors who have been the diversity hire, and they say how hard that is, to walk into a set where everyone knows that you're hired because of your gender or your race, and you feel like, again, you have to prove yourself. And one director I spoke to, she said that the crew, a lot of these guys that have been working on this TV show for a long time, and they wanted the opportunity to direct. So when she came in, they were like, here comes a diversity hire, and then they would try to mess her up as much as they could.
I heard very similar stories from female directors, and it's interesting, so many good women directors, and this happened to Patty Jenkins. She had a very good film with Monster, earned Charlize Theron her Oscar. She didn't work for, 13 or 14 years, and was doing episodic television, and that is a typical career path for a lot of these female directors. And I heard that very same, the crews can be really rough when you walk on as a female. Another anecdote I heard from the producer Amy Pascal was what a game changer Wonder Woman was, precisely because it proved that young boys would accept a female hero. They didn't blink. It was, this is the world they're growing up with. And I just think the idea of just that there's a whole generation coming of age, just naturalized to the images of Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel and Black Panther. This is the world they're going. This is this is the soup they're in, this is the,
Exactly.
you know, this the water they're swimming in, and it's all about shaping those expectations.
Yeah.
You know, and it's really exciting.
You know, I've never been a fan of superhero movies. I just didn't grow up reading comic books. I was the weird one loving classic film. But I went to see Wonder Woman and I cried. And I surprised myself that I cried, but it felt so empowering to see her walk in slow motion across the battlefield. It was exciting.
Yeah, there's no denying it. I think we're ready to take some questions, and I think, is JT here? JD, I'm sorry, JD, I'm sorry. I call you JT?
JD, yeah, I've got the mic right here, and if there's questions, if people want to raise their hands, I'll bring her out.
I see hands. Is that working?
I think so.